All right, gang, the slide, I think, kind of says it all for where my head's at regarding kind of our devotional tonight and where we are as a congregation. It's fruit-bearing season. It's time for us to get to work bearing fruit. And I told y'all in a lesson last summer, probably, it's one of those weird Nick lessons that you're like, what is he talking about? Oh, wait, maybe that makes sense. That in the Bible, humans are often compared to trees. That's a theme throughout Scripture. And before we land on Jesus' words tonight to drive home that theme, that hyperlink that he clicks on in his message in the Sermon on the Mount, I want us to think about all the way back in the first creation account in Genesis chapter 1 and how that account works, those 6 days of God's working, and that they're set up in 2 sets of 3. So there's day 1, 2, and 3 where God acts. And then there's days 4, 5, and 6 where God builds on what he did in days 1, 2, and 3. So in day 4, God expands on or populates what he created, what he brought into being in day 1. On day 5, he expands on and populates what he brought into being in day 2. And then on day 3, the same thing, but day 3 is also interesting. Day 3 and 6 are the same way, except day 3 and 6 are also interesting because the first days 1, 2, 4, and 5, God does basically one thing on each day. And it's a big thing, but it's just one thing. And then on days 3 and 6, God does one thing and then slides in a bonus thing on each day. So when we back up and look at those days, so the story starts with existence, with the cosmos being void and empty, formless and void. So it's ruled by chaos. And then on day 1, light. On day 2, the waters are separated from the waters and the heavens are established. And then on day 3, 2 things happen. The dry land emerges out of the water, and then trees appear. Vegetation appears, especially trees that bear fruit with seed in them. And then on day 4, God takes that light and turns it into the sun, moon, and stars. And on day 5, he creates the birds to fill the air, and the air swarmers and the water swarmers. That's kind of how they're linked together, to fill those 2 places. And then on day 6, we get the bonus thing. Like, the bonus thing was the fruit trees on day 3. The bonus thing on day 6 is humans, who are meant to do what? To be fruitful, and to have seed, to bring forth seed, but importantly, to bear fruit. We've been meant to bear fruit from the very beginning. And this theme, whenever we think about trees, in our Western kind of mostly, urban or suburban culture, trees are mostly for us decorations. But for the farmers around us and for folks who grew up mostly in an agricultural mindset, trees are so much more than that. Trees are, not only do they bear fruit, not only are they there for food, but trees also, they hold the soil together. They hold the land together. And that got me thinking about our theme for this year of being together. Because I remember there was, I think I was in I was in high school. And I grew up in Alabama, and I grew up in kind of Tornado Alley in Alabama, and we had a lot of pine trees on our property. And as anybody who knows much about trees knows, pine trees don't exactly dive deep with their roots, and their roots don't exactly tangle up together. So they're real easy to blow down. So we had a storm come through, and when I walked out of the house the next morning, there were like 30 or 40 pine trees on our property, and they were all laying exactly parallel. It was really neat to look at, but one of them was leaning on the porch right over the window to my bedroom, so that was a little less neat to look at. But it got me thinking about our theme and about how we as trees are meant to work together, how trees in a forest don't get blown over that way because their roots lock up together. Just like our hands on that banner are together, the roots of the trees get interlocked, intertangled, and support one another. And that's part of our challenge as believers as we go through this period of time, is as we're looking to bear fruit together, that we don't turn on one another, that we continue to support one and encourage one another. And so I've got these verses from Matthew chapter 7 that were part of my devotional reading last week that I really wanted to talk about. Matthew 7. Jesus is wrapping up the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is one of the most brilliant passages of teaching ever by anybody. And when it's meant to be one cohesive whole from chapter 5, from the Beatitudes, all the way through to the wise man building his house on the rock and the foolish man building his house in the ravine, in the wadi, waiting for a flood to come down. Everybody in the neighborhood, that's why the foolish man's foolish. It's not just because he found some sand to build on. It's because the only place where there's sand out there to build is in a ravine where floodwaters are going to come storming down from the hillside, and everybody but him knows what's going to happen. That's why the wise man and foolish man parable works. But before he gets there, he warns his followers to watch out. Watch out for false prophets. They will come to you dressed like sheep, but inside they are hungry wolves. You'll be able to tell them by the fruit they bear. You don't find grapes growing on thorn bushes, do you? Or figs on thistles? Well, in the same way, good trees produce good fruit, and bad trees produce bad fruit. Actually, good trees can't produce bad fruit, nor can bad ones produce good fruit. And every tree that doesn't produce good fruit is cut down and thrown in the fire. So, you must recognize them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Only those who do the will of my Father in heaven. On that day, lots of people will say to me, Master, Master, we prophesied in your name, didn't we? We cast out demons in your name. We performed lots of powerful deeds in your name. Then I will have to say to them, I never knew you. Go away from me, you workers of lawlessness. One of the great lies of our time is to suppose that because Jesus brings forgiveness and urges us to be forgiveness people, meek and gentle, that there's no sharp edge to his message. To hear some people, you'd think the whole of the Christian message was simply a call to accept one another, never to judge one another, never to judge another person. Indeed, doesn't Jesus himself tell us at the beginning of this chapter not to judge? that verse is quoted again and again by people who would do well to ponder this teaching as well and hear them being said at the same time in the same place to the same people. Jesus is quite clear that there are such persons as false prophets, as people who appear to be his followers, but who are in fact have never known him. And life would be a lot simpler if we could just tell at a glance who the true and the false prophets were. But the only guide Jesus offers is the hyperlink back to this theme from Genesis through the rest of the books of Moses, through Psalm 1, and through the prophets. The theme of the tree. The picture of the tree. Sooner or later, and it might be a lot later, or it might happen quite suddenly, the fruit of someone's life will appear, and then you can tell whether they were real or whether they were fooling themselves and others. In Jesus' day, there were no shortage of these folks. There were no shortage of such people. Jesus and the apostles talked more than once about people who would turn up and declare that they were prophesying in the name of Jesus or in God's name and would lead people astray. The second and third generation of the church faced this same problem, and they came up with a rule of thumb that if someone arrives claiming to be a prophet but asks for money, they're false prophets. That was the simple rule in the Didache, the teaching of the 12. It's a document that served the late first and early second century church as kind of like a Bible study book, the way that we get books to use to help us study. And we might expand that focus on money in a couple other areas that we've seen ministers go astray publicly. Money is so often linked with sex and power, the demand for power. Some false teachers offer their followers moral license to behave however they want, as long as they support the false teacher, which is in serious contrast to Jesus' standard that he presents in chapter 5 of the Sermon on the Mount, in chapter 15, in Matthew chapter 19. Part of the lie today is that Jesus didn't mind about those things. He just wanted you to accept your neighbor. Others are eager for personal power. And you can tell when someone challenges them, whether they're concerned about power or whether they're concerned about blessing the kingdom. And yeah, some today are in it for the money. And when Jesus uses this image of the tree, he's drawing on that ancient biblical picture from Psalm 1. The first psalm speaks of God's true people like trees planted by streams of water, who will bear fruit at the right time, while the wicked are like chaff that the wind blows away. In Jeremiah chapter 17, he develops the tree image, thinking of the tree that sends out its roots to look for the water it needs. Fruit-bearing season for us is definitely a time when we should be dedicating ourselves to doing that. Amen. To sending out our roots to look for the living water, to sending out our roots to lock hands, to lock arms with one another, so that if one of us slips, 3 or 4 of us are there to catch us before we fall. And the challenge of these verses in Matthew 7 isn't just one of learning to recognize true Christian teaching from false. The challenge is to become ourselves trees that bear good fruit. People who not only say, Lord, Lord, when it suits us, but who also apply ourselves to the much harder task of discerning and doing God's will. So that's my devotional for tonight. And now David Jones is going to come and lead us in some more songs.